But yeah, let's talk about the Nasrallah speech. That was 2 nights ago. You know, like when Nasrallah speaks, the entire Arab world stops and listens. What was I watched a little bit of it. I didn't watch the whole thing, I admit, but maybe Ali, if you can talk a little bit about what he said in general, and then we can discuss.
Yes, it was one of these speeches, and I'm sorry I have a bit of a sore throat, so my voice sounds a little rough. But it was one of these speeches that he gave on, typically his speeches are on occasions commemorating, the martyrdom of a commander or a respected member of the resistance. And this was one such occasion. It was the martyrdom, I think the 7th anniversary of the martyrdom of a man called Mustafa Badruddin. But these occasions are used to make sort of broad speeches, give analysis. And this was, in some respects, similar to what we've heard before from Nasrallah, where he lays out sort of a broad regional vision, sort of weighs the balance of forces in the region. He was very confident. He sounded very self-assured. And I think some of the key takeaways is that he talked about how Israel and the United States are really in a strategic bind. I mean, one thing I'll say, a point he makes time and again, is that the United States is the one that calls the shots. It's not Israel. And I think that I agree with that. We've seen that in terms of this kind of this dance that the Biden administration is playing, where they try to make it appear as if they're reigning in Israel when they're not actually doing so. But aside from that, what Nasrallah says is that, Israel is really in a bind because it has two choices. One is to accede to the demands of the resistance in order to get a ceasefire, and those demands are well known. They include, of course, an end to the war, allowing people to return home, Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, unfettered flow of aid and reconstruction, and of course, an exchange of prisoners. So that's one way, but that constitutes defeat for Israel, and that's unacceptable to Israel. On the other side, Israel has the choice to continue the war, a war of attrition, which it is clearly losing. And I think we could, just see from the presentation that John has just given us how severe that defeat is militarily. And you just think about how little of that you see in the mainstream media. You never see the videos or the reports of the resistance that we just saw from John in the New York Times, on CNN, on the BBC. So people are unaware of the extent to which Israel is losing the war on the ground. And I say that to emphasize that Nasrallah's analysis is fact-based. It's grounded in the reality. And that's, of course, not just in Gaza, which he called the main front, but he also talked about Lebanon, which we've seen, where they have been gradually escalating the tactics and escalating the type of weapons they're using. And he also made reference to the fronts with the Iraqi resistance and Yemen. And so, again, that reminds us that the resistance looks at this as not a single battle, a single decisive battle which is going to defeat Israel, but a war over a period of time which Israel is losing, and the resistance feels confident that it's winning. So that's really what I took away from it. But I know there were other points that others might want to emphasize from the speech.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the October 6th versus October 7th reality, just he talked about how October 6th, there was no Palestinian state. They were ghettoized and ignored. And October 7th, because of heroic indigenous resistance that was built under blockade, and the resistance since then, has completely has Israel in upheaval. It has them their military generals are being mocked. They don't believe that the people in their society don't believe that the army can take care of them anymore. The students are out. He talked about the student protesters. The students are out in the streets, inspired by the resistance and the courageous resistance of the fighters, but also of the people of Gaza who have been enduring through this, and everybody watches it and are inspired by, like what can we do? Like, people ask themselves, what can we do? Because you watch what people in Gaza are doing, and that has inspired people. Whereas the juxtaposition is the Israelis are just seen as, child killers who mock the international community. He Nasrallah noted a couple times of UN speeches where the Israeli UN ambassador held up that card and said, whatever the ceasefire address is Yahya Sinwar, and he held up the card for Sinwar, and Nasrallah was like, just watch that scene and tell me who's winning and who's losing the war. I think it's the same ambassador ripped up the UN charter and just
he had a tiny little baby paper shredder, and he put.
I thought when I saw the tiny little, it was Gilad Erdan.
Yeah.
When I saw the tiny little paper shredder, I thought, that phrase comes into your head: the world's tiniest violin.
Yeah.
So the world's tiniest paper
He
shredder.
mocked it, and everybody mocked it, and the world mocked it, right?
Yeah.
So Israel's shown itself to be this strategic. He pointed out, like, they're losing the war, so they're a strategic liability to the United States. The United States, the UK, all these countries have to come save them all the time. They have to air bridge all the weapons to them. They have to actually literally knock Iranian missiles out of the sky for them. And they're just a brutal state that insults the world, kills children, and their own people don't feel confident that their settler project can last. And he did that with the sort of classic Nasrallah Israeli media summary, right? Like he does the Israeli media roundup, and he says, just listen to what they say. Well, he says two things: look at the battlefield results, but also look at what the enemy says. Look at what the defense minister says. Look at how they mock Netanyahu for saying that they just need Rafah for the complete victory. If we don't have Rafah, there's no complete victory. He's being mocked for that. They want the chief of staff Halevi to resign. There's protests in the streets constantly.
And if you well, I want to come back to that, but I just want to say more about the speech and then sort of pick up on something Nasrallah said and bring it up to date in a sense. But he also talked about the impotence of the Arab regimes. He was talking about Lebanon in particular, on the issue of Syrian refugees, where internally in Lebanon there's calls for the many Syrian refugees to go back home. And he says, they should be able to go back home, but they should be able to go back home safely. And what that means is that the Lebanese government should demand that the US sanctions that prevent Syria from rebuilding, the so-called Caesar sanctions, should be lifted. And the way to pressure the West is to say, okay, so if you don't want them to go back home to Syria where they can actually live not under these brutal sanctions, then we're going to open the shores of Lebanon and let them sail to Europe. And he said they would immediately change their policy. But when you're a government that waits for a phone call from this or that Western embassy to tell you what to do, and you have no sovereignty, then you can't take decisions. You're not really the master of your own fate. And so that's a point that applies more broadly, because he's contrasting the sovereignty, in a sense, of the resistance axis, the fact that they are taking the decisive decisions about the future, about the destiny of their people in the region, as opposed to the Arab dictatorships that are lining up to help the United States and Israel shoot down missiles that are aimed at Israeli military bases, which is just absolutely extraordinary. But the point I wanted to pick up on, when Nasrallah talked about, the disarray within Israel, the defeatism, the confusion, look at what's happening just in the last few hours, where Netanyahu, the prime minister, and Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, are in an open public battle over the future of Gaza. I mean, and again, they're assuming that they were going to be able to dictate the future of Gaza, which clearly they're not. But Gallant is saying we have to be very clear and say publicly that we will not install a military government in Gaza. That's to say, an Israeli military government in Gaza for the long term. And Netanyahu is saying, I'm not going to allow the Palestinian Authority back to Gaza, and I'm not going to allow Hamas to rule Gaza. But Gallant, presumably as the defense minister, is the one who is receiving the reports from the ground directly, and is therefore making the assessment that there's no way we can hold Gaza. There's no way we can govern Gaza. They can't even hold Jabalia and Zaytun 6-7 months after they claimed they had cleared the resistance out of them. And so there is just this complete unraveling within Israel that is mirrored by the complete, I think, confusion in the United States, where on the one hand, the Biden administration keeps saying they don't want Israel to attack Rafah, or they want humanitarian aid to go in. But at the same time, today, the Washington Post reported that despite saying that they're delaying sending the 2,000-pound bombs, which presumably Israel already has big stockpiles of anyway, they're going ahead to send $1 billion worth of tank ammunition, tactical vehicles. That's interesting, isn't it? Because that's a sign that a lot of their vehicles have been destroyed in Gaza, and other military equipment. And at the same time, the Rafah crossing has been closed now for how long? And that's just an absolute catastrophe for people in Gaza. And there's no talk of getting it open. Remember last week we talked about that flash in the pan American plan to put a mercenary company to run the Rafah crossing? Well, as John showed us today, the resistance is attacking and killing and injuring Israeli soldiers at the Rafah crossing. So which mercenary firm is going to go into that situation? Or which Arab puppet regime of the Americans is going to go into that situation? It's even reported that the Palestinian Authority, which is closely allied with Israel and the United States, of course, is refusing to go to the Rafah crossing. So it's to tie it back to what Nasrallah is saying, I think it's very clear that Israel continues to be able to carry out horrifying massacres, murder, destroy, kill, starve, attack hospitals, utter horrors, but it's losing the war. And, people will often scoff at that. But I looked up these figures today just because it's an analogy we hear about all the time. Vietnam's official count of how many civilians were killed during the American war is over 2 million. And more than 1 million fighters were killed. So that's 3 million people. And remember that the United States dropped, there's a study from Yale that was published a few years ago. The United States dropped 2,756,941 tons of bombs on Cambodia to try to defeat the Viet Cong, who had bases in Cambodia. And to put that in perspective, according to this study, so that's 2.8 million tons of bombs into Cambodia. The Allies dropped just over 2 million tons of bombs during all of World War II. And the United States still lost the American war in Vietnam. So this is what we have to remember, that in an insurgency, in a war of liberation, the enemy, the aggressor, the colonizer, the occupier, the representatives of Western savagery and barbarism will always kill more people among the indigenous and native people. We saw that with the French in Algeria. We saw it in South Africa too. It's always the case. And that's not to say we should be casual about this or we should be sanguine about it. Our hearts are torn every single day about the horror that is being visited on people in Gaza. Our friends, our family, our colleagues. We want this to stop now. But I say this because murdering civilians is not equal to victory. If it was, then the United States would have been the winner in Vietnam. The United States would have been the winner in Afghanistan. The United States would have been the winner in all its other losing wars. And Israel would have been the winner in its losing war in Lebanon. So this is the analytically, we have to make that shift and not allow, not allow anyone to say, to introduce this defeatist sense that, well, Israel is bombing and killing more, therefore it's winning. No, Israel is losing the war. Israel has lost the war.
Yeah, the biggest battle in Palestinian history, as he pointed out, Nasrallah pointed out, and Israel's losing. That there's no need for defeatism in the face of that. That is a paradigm shattering reality that we're living through right now, with brutal consequences on our friends and colleagues and everybody in Gaza. But the war is being won right now. Israelis admit it. The Americans admit it. The State Department admitted that there's no total victory, that that's not a possibility. These kind of concepts, total victory. So at some point, if Israel wants to get back its captives, it's going to have to end the war. And when you end the war, you lose it. And that's why when Netanyahu says we lose the war if we don't go into Rafah, he's saying we're losing the war. Otherwise, why do you have to go into Rafah if you're right? If you lose the war, if you don't go into Rafah, that means today you're losing the war.
Yeah.
So they're admitting that.
And they're saying that it's also an existential war.
Yes, they're
right?
losing
They
an
said
existential war.
if they lose, i.e. when they lose, it's the end of the Israeli project, which we talked about last week. But yeah, they're in a panic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the bit that you mentioned earlier, John, that really struck me about the Nasrallah speech. He always makes a point of, not addressing the Israeli media, but addressing the fact that he and Hezbollah generally have, keep a close eye on the enemy's media, and when that's the part that struck me, that he mentioned the consensus within the Israeli media, even if it's just a tacit consensus, as we've just mentioned, that that Israel has lost the war in Gaza. They've lost militarily. Even if it's the beginning of the end, that's what it is. It's a long ending.
And part of that, I mean, I think this is a point I may have made before, but, back in the 1990s, I remember Edward Said always used to lament. He would say how, Israel has all these centers at its universities and think tanks focused on Arab studies, and they study all these, they have all these experts looking at the Arab world through a microscope, and in the United States the same thing, whereas the Arab world didn't have a single center of Israel studies. And his point was, knowledge is power, and they were using their knowledge in order to defeat or to keep Arabs in a subjugated position. And now I think the opposite is true. It's generally true that I think we, being on the side of justice, being on the side of truth, have a far better and closer and more nuanced understanding of Israel and the way they think there, and their sort of internal disputes, than they have of the Palestinians or the Arab world, or those they would see as their enemies more generally. Yeah. They believe the crude stereotypes. They believe that Arabs are savages who aren't capable, who just sort of brutish and unintelligent. And so they underestimate.
Yeah,
They underestimate capabilities.
something I've really noticed since the 7th of October is a lot of Israelis saying this. They have this phrase, "We speak Arabic now." I mean, it's not new since the 7th of October. But they've been really emphasizing that, and what they're saying is that, you know, Arabs and Arabic are brutal savages, basically. And we understand their language, and their language that the only language they understand is violence and force and killings. But you know, that's just yet another example of how they don't actually speak Arabic, as it were. Although yes, they do have some people who speak Arabic, but they don't understand their enemy. They don't understand their enemy, even though they think they do.
Yeah. Yeah, we need a lot of psychoanalysts to help us understand what we're seeing, for sure.
But I mean, I
yeah.
think just to wrap up on maybe on the Nasrallah speech, but you know, what Nasrallah does is he paints a broad strategic picture, and that picture is that, you know, yes, you have to look at the battles, you have to get right down into the details, as John is helping us do, and that's very informative. But when you step back and look at the big picture, and you see this as a war which is going to take years to reach its conclusion, the resistance is winning. I think that's the takeaway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I hope our victory doesn't take years. I hope it comes sooner.
Well, in a previous speech, I think it was the one before this one, or it might have been 2 speeches back, he said Israel is going away. He said, I can't tell you it's going to be months or a year, but, you know, and I hope I'm not misquoting, but I think he said it could be 5 or 10, something like that. So, I mean, but that gives a clue of the type of time frame they're looking at, and the type of time frame. And of course, they would be ready if it's 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, because everything we're seeing now, and again, it goes back to, you know, when John talks about al-Ghul starting the armed struggle back in the 1990s, and with very rudimentary, to get to this point was a project that took decades. And so these are people, the people planning the resistance, not just in Gaza, but across the region, are thinking in terms of decades. They're thinking in terms of, we are not going to see the liberation necessarily. We're probably going to be killed, but our children and grandchildren are. And that is a very, in a sense, optimistic vision. They believe that liberation will come. They believe that their grandchildren will be free of this occupation, this barbarism, and this savagery. And that's something that I think is important to really hold on to.
Thanks so much for that, Ali.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.